Okay. Hi, everyone. Um, Today I'm going to talk about optics from the ground up. And in particular, my goal is to give um, an exposition of optics from 3 points of view. The three I found most relevant to what I'm working on. And as far as I know, the only three there are. And so we should start by talking about what optics are, or at least should be. So they began as a structure in functional programming, uh, answering the need of looking inside data structures. Okay, so you may have something like a user record with different fields. This is a string. You might have like birthday, which is a date, things like this. And you want some kind of modular way to access records inside this, access fields inside this record. Okay, so something that given a user extracts, for example, the name, and something that given a string builds back a user with a given date, birthday. And considering all the kinds of data structure we can build, people quickly realized that lenses, which is what I just described, were not enough, and you needed something a bit more general. Okay, for example, if you have instead of a user, you have like a maybe type. Okay, which is more or less the same thing as the +1 monad applied to type. What happens is that now we cannot access both A and whatever this is, but we have a different kind of structure for this type. Okay, so we need a different kind of accessor, which is not a lens, it's called a prism. And then it turns out that you can compose this way of structuring data. So you can have something like a user whose birthday is not always known. So it's a maybe type. And now to access birthday, it's not sufficient to use a lens anymore, not sufficient to use a prism anymore. You need some combination of both. Okay, so this will ends up being called an affine traversal. But in general, people try to figure out how to do this kind of destructuring for data structures in a compositional manner. And in particular, they try to find easy abstractions to deal with it. Okay, so something that doesn't really care about how I presented you the data structure, but at the end of the day is versatile enough to deal with all the things I throw at it. Okay, so trees, lists, or whatever I imagine. And on the other hand, this is more relevant to what I do here. People, and by people I probably mean Jules, realized that optics were actually a good abstraction for another thing, which is cybernetics or and then feedback systems. Okay, so this is due to the fact that in the systems we have a flow of information forward, and then after some time a flow of information backward, and this is what optics turn out to model more or less. Okay, so I think the story went that at some point people, Jules, realized that open games were actually families of lenses, and then someone pointed out to Jules that Bayesian games couldn't be modeled by lenses alone, but needed something more sophisticated like optics, because lenses need this Cartesian structure around, whereas stochastic maps do not form a Cartesian category. And so at that point, he started, and then me, Bruno, and other people followed to realize that optics were actually a good idea for modeling cybernetics, and it all sort of came together. So now that we know what optics are for, let's start with the first presentation of these objects, which is Tambara modules. Okay, So for a lot of time, I thought Tambara modules were very obscure and not really a nice conceptualization of optics. But lately I understood what they are, and I understand that they are pretty neat. So I will try to convey the same intuition that I have about them to you. So Tambara modules are actually how optics were defined originally, as far as I know. So people gave optics as encoded by this and over profanters of a certain kind. This is what we're going to do today. And as far as I understand, this was kind of a hack. Okay, so like people understood that was a way to do this, and the things that you could do with this were very, very neat. Because, for example, using profanter encoding is very easy to compose optics from different types, and like polymorphism in Haskell lifts a lot of weight for you. But then, like at the same time, there was a lot of mathematics going on the other side. So about the same time that optics were defined in the Haskell community, as far as I understand, Daisuke Tambara was publishing a work on representation theory, where he introduced so-called Tambara modules. And then a year later, Pastor Street wrote this very beautiful and long paper on the very abstract nonsense behind Tambara modules. And funnily enough, all this tied together, and now we're using the mathematics developed very far from here to do optics, okay? And most importantly, this mathematical theory gave a way to actually move beyond profanter encoding, okay, by working out an equivalence with an explicit description of optics. And this theorem is, I think, the crown jewel of Tambara theory. And this is where I want to go for the first part of this talk. So let's start by the definition. So let's fix two categories, C and D, which are actually M categories. What this means is that M is a monoidal category, which is acting on both, okay, on the left. And to quickly recall, like this means there is a functor that I call star from M times C to C, and another from M times D to D, okay? So conceptually, this means that we can represent objects and morphism of M in both C and D. And so talk about things like an object M times X, where M is in M and X is in either C or D. And then if we have a morphism in M, then we can make it act on objects of C or D by taking, switching back to my old notation here, by making it act on said object, okay, by functoriality. In fact, it happens that sometimes this action can really be encoded by a functor from M to C or M to D, okay? So it's really a way to put M inside these categories. And what's a Tambara module then? So first of all, we have to remember what's a profanter. So a profanter from C to D is something of this type, which is functorial on both slots, okay? So this means that given PAB and given F from A to A prime in C, and given G from B prime to B in D, then we get, first of all, a functorial covariant action of the second B prime, bringing us to A B prime, and then we have a functorial action of this first, which goes in the other way. and they compose to give the factorial action of the pair f of g. Okay. And conceptually, profunctors are like relations, but one dimension up. Okay. So they witness a relation between objects. So we can think of elements of this set to be witnesses of a relation from A to B, or better from C to D in particular, relating these two objects. And then since we are relating sets and categories and not sets, then this is of course factorial, and so on and so on. Okay. Then like the most common profunctor that we encounter in our life as category theories is the profunctor. Okay. Which is, by the way, the identity in the category of profunctors on a given category. And this also hints at the fact that profunctors can be thought also in a different way, which is the sort of generalized functors. Okay, so if functor is giving me the set of morphisms from A to B according to my notion of morphism in C, then a general profunctor can also be thought of as giving me morphism from C to D. Okay, so-called heteromorphisms. So imagine I have A in C and I have B in D, then morphism like elements of the set PAB can be thought as morphisms from A to B. Okay, and then the fact that this is bifactorial is just to make this sensible as a concept, because of course if I have, we all know in category theory, if I have a morphism and if I have another morphism here and another morphism here, I should be able to compose these things. Okay, and so the fact that I can compose things on the left is the factoriality in the first slot. The fact that I can compose things on the right is factoriality in the second slot. And the fact that the order of this operation doesn't matter is bifactoriality. Okay, so this is going to be a useful heuristic here. Okay, so thinking of profunctors as generalized Hom functors. So now a Tambara module ties together these two things by realizing that when C and D are categories for a given M, so I should have kept this, then there is another thing that we expect from morphisms, namely that they can be lifted, well, they can be decorated with an action. Let's see what I mean. So if I have a morphism from A to A prime in, say, C, then C is an category, so I can tensor with M at the beginning and at the end, and I can imagine there is an identity here, and therefore F has been lifted to M times F, which is a functor from M times A to M times A prime. Okay, so I can attach an M, which is some kind of context of our morphism, which is sitting there not doing anything, but there is a way to do so. Okay, and in particular, this gives an operation that from let's write it like this, from C A prime gives us morphisms in C M of A, M times A, M times A prime. Okay, and this is dinatural in M and natural in A and A prime. Okay, so we don't really need to understand what this means. It means that it's like well behaved. And a thing like this is called a strength, okay, colloquially named ST. And so we understand that if C and D are both categories, a set of heteromorphisms from the first to the latter should also have such a structure, right? So we realized that definition, a Tambara module is a profanter C to D. Okay, this is a notation to mean this thing here. Equipped with another additional structure called a strength, which is a family of morphisms of this form, which is again dinatural in M and natural in, well, in the other two slots, which satisfy some condition, some reasonable coherence conditions. Like, for example, if M is the identity, then I really want this to be trivial. Or if I do this and then I apply the strength for like N, and I get something of the form N times M times A and times M times B, then there is an operation for like in the structure vectory that collapses these things into a single application of the action. And then I want basically this to be the same as doing using the strength for the product directly. Okay. So nothing exciting, is just I have a bunch of morphisms and they should relate in a sensible way. So a Tambara module at the end of the day is, again, giving heteromorphisms between two categories with the twist that these categories have an action of a given monoidal category, and therefore I want my heteromorphism to respect this, okay? And so let's see some examples of this thing. So as I said, the home functor of any M category is a Tambara module, okay, where strength is given by the monoidal action of the monoidal category M. But something a little less trivial is if C is Cartesian, and this is the same as D and M, then if I have a morphism like this, sorry, if I have a morphism here, then I can map it to anything of this form simply by keeping M around and tensoring, okay? But I'm not confined to do this. I can, like my profanter is encoding one opinionated way to transform things of a category C into things of category D, even if these two categories are the same. So what I can do is, for example, encode morphisms with side effects. So suppose that T is a monad on C, which is monoidal, okay? I think monoidal is the right term, but what I mean is that there is a monoidal laxator like this, okay? Then what I can do is define a profanter, which is basically the home functor of Glasgow of T. And this is a different opinion of what it means to map from objects of C to objects of D, which is, okay, it's a map, but it has side effects. Okay, it's non-deterministic in some way, for example. And this is, again, a Tambara module because it can, if I have, sorry, a map here, I have to map to something like this. And what I can do is first do the identity of, yeah, so this is something of this form. And the result here is of this form. So I can do first M times phi, get here, And then, oh, sorry, I think I need a strength. I don't need monoidality. Apologies. And then I can use strength here. Well, the strength of the monad. Okay, I get a morphism like I want. Okay, so there can be many different Tambara modules of the same pair of categories, even if they coincide. Okay. Now, given that we have this new structure in mind, a first thought of a category theory should be, how are things without my structure related to things with my structure? Okay. So something I didn't mention, that this is a category, and morphisms are maps of profunctors, which is the natural transformations, which commute with strength. Okay, so it's kind of the sort of natural notion of morphism here. So it's obvious that if I have a Tambara module, then I can forget that it is a Tambara module and just recover the underlying profunctor. But can I go the other way? Okay, and the answer is yes, and I can go in two ways the other way. Okay, and as we're going to see, they will be unsurprisingly adjoined. Okay, so how do I get these two ways? Well, the first one is, so I think about this problem. So we have a set of more heteromorphisms from C to D. Okay, so things that map objects of C to an object of D. And I want now to make them compatible with the action of on both categories. So one thing I can do is, well, let's look at the structure. Like, let's look at these morphisms and let's get rid of everything which is not compatible with this action. Okay. So I need a strength like this. And I might look at all like the morphism F, which can actually be mapped here. Okay. And this is sort of the minimal way to get out a Tambara module from a profunctor. I call it the Michelangelo way, because if the profunctor is the block of marble, then this is sculpting a Tambara module out of it. Okay, so the Tambara module is inside the profunctor all the time. And the actual definition of this, which is usually called theta, is given by an end. Okay, so this is called the theta comonad and was defined by Pastor and Street in their doubles for monoidal categories paper. And what's the strength of this Tambara module, where we only need to realize that an end is actually a wedge from this object here to, sorry, a co-wedge from this object, like from, so it gives a sector like this, okay? So we can always map things from, no, it's the other way around, yeah. So we can always get things like this. We have these maps, which are the data of the end, basically. They are like projections out of a limit, just to have this in mind. And the automatically dinatural and functoriality of the end makes it work. And one can prove, as I said, that this is left adjoint to, oh, I call this comonad, but I should really say functor. And this is left adjoint to, no, this is right adjoint to the forgetful functor. Okay. But then there's also one other way, which is a bit different, but related. So instead of, we still have a profunctor from C to D. And now we want to get a map like this. So instead of getting rid of everything in the domain, which is not going to give us something in the codomain, we could do something else. We could do the dual thing, which is taking for granted that everything here is correct, and then forcibly add it to the codomain, okay? So we enlarge our profunctor, okay? Instead of sculpting it down, we grow it. And so if the first was an end, you might guess that the second is given by a conend. And this is indeed the case. Let's call this psi functor, given a profunctor P on AB is given by this long coend expression. So what we do is basically construct it manually by tying together things that can compose to this thing on the left, things that can compose with this thing on the right, and reconstructing the set of morphisms, supposed morphism from A to B through this composition here. Okay, but since we use the action here, see that the idea of being equivariant in a sense with respect to the action of M is baked in the definition. Okay, so now we are enlarging the profunctor by adding things instead of shrinking it down. So again, this can be proved to actually yield a Tambara module, and this gives us the other adjoint to the forgetful functor, okay? And this is called, again, this is again defined by Pastor and Strait in their paper. So at the end of the day, we have this adjunction here, and we can turn our profunctors into Tambara modules in two different ways, okay? And so I slipped on comonad because usually these are, so we have an adjunction like this. Theta, this is psi. Okay, so usually we are only interested in the comonads and in the monad and the comonad induced profunctors by these adjunctions. So the first one is do psi, then do u, and this is going to be a monad. And the other one is do theta and then do u, and this is going to be a comonad. And these are again adjoint, and this means in particular that the Kleisli category of u psi is equivalent to the co-Kleisli category of the other, which is also equivalent to the right-hand side of the adjunction, okay? So we see that the structure of a Tambara module can be encoded as an algebra of the psi monad as a co-algebra of the theta monad and as a Tambara structure, okay? These three things coincide. So we are ready to actually give the definition. And this definition, which is going to be quite simple, is simply the following. So optics from ST to AB, remember these are pairs of an object in C and an object in D, are given by taking the end over all Tambara modules from CD. I might consider writing CD here, such that, so in the functor we put here are the set maps between evaluating P at AB and evaluating P at ST. So it's pretty simple, and yet quite obscure, because what is this actually doing? So this is where we have to remember what Tambara model is supposed to be, which is opinionated ways to say what it means to go from A to B, even though they are in different categories, and what it means to go from S to T, even though they're in different categories. Okay. So what this is saying is that there are many Tambara modules, each one with its own opinion about what these morphisms are, and taking the and over it means, let's look at what's like the common thing that we all agree on, despite our different opinions of what this morphism should be. And what is that we should agree about how to pull back a morphism between S and T to a morphism between A and B, okay? And indeed, you can see that optics like A and B, ST are, well, this is a matter of convention, but I like this perspective because it's quite conceptual. So I define maps from ST to AB to be the other way around, okay? So that's the way, that's how I picture optics. So we have a morphism here, we have an heteromorphism here, and optics are something that happens in between that when composed to, let's call this optic like phi. So when I do, phi is a kind of transformation from this to this, so that if I have such a morphism, I can compose it with phi to get something of this form, okay? So they allow me, optics allow me to pull back morphisms between C and D as given by a Tambara module. Well, actually not a Tambara module, but every Tambara module, okay? So no matter what my Tambara module is saying morphisms are, I know that I can use an optic to pull back morphisms between S and T to morphism between A and B, okay? So this is the idea behind what Tambara modules, what profunctor encoding is saying, okay? So imagine this as in the data structure interpretation, S and T are some data types that are store some kind of information or say record type, and a pink arrow here. So a Tambara, so a heteromorphism between these two is giving me a way to get or read, say, the name of a user and return a different name for it, okay? And this is some kind of other data structure, okay? And now I want to say that an optic is something that if I have an operation that does this for a value inside my record type, then the optics gives me a way to pull back this operation on the whole data structure, okay? So I go from mapping a string to a string to mapping a user to a user by focusing, and that's what the optics does, on, say, its name field, and do a set operation there, okay? So optics focus by pulling back morphisms of fields inside data structures. So there are two reasons why this encoding is quite useful in practice. And the first one, which we can already see, is that composing these things is quite easy because, well, at the end of the day, I mean, if we ignore the coend for a bit, an optic is some particular morphism of sets. So imagine if I have another thing like XY, then if I have an optic like this and an optic like this, sorry, the other way around, then this is sort of a map of sets from P, A, B, PST, kind of, and this is a map from PST to PXY, except there are like ends around things like this. But I can just compose them, and I can do this under the sign of n, so this is not a problem, and I get the composite optic, okay? As far as I understand from the way that Haskell works, this is totally invisible to the programmer. So I can just say, compose this with this other thing, and Haskell will figure out that the things that I asked to compose are actually kind of maps of types, and so they can be composed in the way that maps of types are supposed to be composed, okay? And the drawback of this definition is that it's not really clear what optics are. So I drew this thing because what could I have drawn? There's nothing here saying to me what an optic actually looks like. Okay, it's not a map of sets. It's some kind of subset of this, but it's also a product. It's weird. There's no explicit description of this thing. And that's where Tambaro theory comes to the rescue, because we can actually prove a very powerful theorem which characterizes optics. And the way this is known is as the Profundter representation theorem. So in its abstract form, it appears in Pasteur Street for the first time, as far as I understand. I don't know who is the first one who published or at least noticed that this is actually talking about optics. And the statement of this theorem is that the Profundter representation, the Profundter encoding, sorry, of optics is equivalent, actually isomorphic for every AB and ST, to this other way of writing them. So before diving in the proof, which is like 6 different versions of the unit lemma chained after one another, let's just have a moment and look at this and see how much more explicit the right-hand side is. So the right-hand side is explicitly telling us there is a map in C from S to, well, sorry, first there is an M, which I choose from the big monoidal category M. And then there is a map in C from S to M times A, and in D from M times B to T, okay? So now I know that an optic is something that looks like a tripole of objects. There's a forward map. There is, well, M, which I like to put in the middle for aesthetic reasons, and there's a backward map, okay? And then the fact that this is an and not, sorry, a co-and and not some kind of sigma type tells me that there is an equivalence relation. So it's the set of these tripoles quotiented out by some equivalent relation that we're going to deal with later, okay? So, but now I understand what an optic looks like what's the data that an optic is. Well, could I flip that? So the way we prove this theorem is, as I said, a lot of Yoneda lemmas. I might actually skip this because I'm a bit late on schedule. But it's really, really easy. And the trick is to use the adjunction between this. That's the only thing which is not a Yoneda lemma, plus Yoneda many times. So if someone is interested, well, I'll give reference at the end, or I can get through the proof really quickly at the end of the talk. Let me mention instead that now we can see another way in which people for which people like the perfunctory encoding, which is not only I can compose optics of the same flavor together, I can also compose optics of different flavors, so-called hybrid composition. Okay, so hybrid composition of optics means that I have different monoidal categories, say M and N, acting on C and D. And so when I run the construction on like Tambara modules for these situations, and I run the construction for this situation, I get two different notions of optics, okay? But nevertheless, sometimes I like to compose them. For example, lenses are optics for the Cartesian action of a category, of a Cartesian category itself, and prisms are the dual thing, so co-Cartesian action of a co-Cartesian category in itself. So if my category is like sets and has both structures, I have this situation with two different actions, and I might want to compose lenses and prisms together. And like, if you think about it for a moment, then you realize that if I have a Tambara module if I have this situation, then I can pack up this in something called the coproduct action, which is given by, so these things are like words of an M. So I interleave objects and I create words. Objects are words which alternate object of M and object of N, and morphisms are likewise defined. And I can get an action from this thing by basically interleaving the two actions as well. And then since like evidently I use plus because this is literally the coproduct in the monoidal, the category monoidal categories. Okay, so there are inclusions of M and N into this thing. So like the original actions are still there. I just have more stuff. And then you can also realize that if I have a Tambara module for this thing, then I have a Tambara module. If I have a Tambara module for this situation, then I have a Tambara module for this situation, right? And same for N. And this means that when I do when I look at the definition of perfunctory optic for this situation here, I'm looking at way less Tambara modules than I had before, okay? Way less, because this is more picky. There are both actions to be satisfied, okay? And so there is way less Tambara modules, which means that this thing here will be bigger in principle, right? Because I have, like, these are my constraint on the possible maps. I have less constraints. So what I get at the end of the day is a category of optics, which is bigger than the category of optics for this and a category of optics for this, okay? So long story short, it's really, what this is really doing is taking optics for one action, taking optics for another action, embedding these two optics in a bigger notion of optics, a more general notion, and doing the composition there, okay? Except that for the nature of polymorphism in, I guess, Haskell, if I do it in actual programming language, then this definition allow me to simply concatenate, again, doing composition between two things, and the compiler can itself figure out how to make the two set of constraints agree on the common denominator, basically. Okay, so polymorphism makes this idea of composing hybrid of hybrid composition much more straightforward. So it's 10 to 6, so to 4. I have 2 more X. Let me just go quickly through them, okay? So what I wanted to say in this part is that once we have the existential representation of optics, which I remind you is something of this form, then I can interpret this in different ways. So for example, I can let's put ourselves in a very simple case first. Okay, so everything is the same category. It's called non-mixed optics, or just optics before they invented mixed optics. What happens is then I can like try to draw this thing, okay? Because monoidal categories are very amenable to be drawn. So if I try to draw an optic like this, I get first a morphism called the view or the forward part, which with one input, which is S, and one output, which is, sorry, and two outputs, which are A and M. And then on the other side, I have U, which is kind of dual, takes in a B and an M and spits out a T. And so I quickly realized that it would be really nice if this could be tied together, okay? And the answer is that yes, this is exactly what was happening. And why is it so? Because as I was telling you before, this representation is giving us optics as triple of objects, view, update, and a choice of residual, but there's also an equivalence relation, okay? And this equivalence relation turns out to relate, or rather identify to optics exactly if I can basically cut out a piece of the view in the form of a morphism between residuals. So this is the new view, and this is the previous V, okay? So what happens if I can cut out this alpha and move it along this wire so that at the end of the day, I get alpha here. Right. So now I have V U, which is equivalent to V prime and prime U prime, and they are related by this thing, which is a sliding of the B, sliding of this along the wire connecting the two residuals here and here, okay? So this wire here. Okay, so this is something very, very evident when you draw it. So there is the equivalence relation on imposed by the coend is telling you that these two wires, the two wires corresponding to residual are connected because I can slide things along them, okay? And when I do this, I don't change the optic, okay? Which is a way to say the residual is some kind of private information of the morphism, all right? Because as far as the external world is concerned, M is never there, okay? All they see is something going out and something going in. Indeed, we can package this structure. So let's return to, we can package this structure in something called a comb, which is nothing but a thing of this shape. Okay, so it's called an open diagram because it's not closed, and it's sort of asking for being completed by a transformation from A to B. Okay, and you can see our old friends, the Tambara modules, in action here. Okay, so this is telling me that an optic is something that takes a transformation from A to B and turns it into transformation from S to T, okay? So looking at this, I can get back the definition of the profundity encoding in a way. But also what I can do is look at some kind of different structure. So if I have a comb like this, so I see F going in, I see A going out, I see B coming in again, and T coming out. I can try to straighten it and B now is coming here. So you say sort of, I open this up, and so that now B is aligned with A and T is aligned with S. And what I see now is that optics look like this. So is there some category in which I can actually draw this diagram? Because I'm not in the category I was in before, especially because I rented the wires, but also because this diagram potentially makes sense even when C is not D and it's not M. And the answer is yes. It's sort of very elegant, but there's just no time to introduce it now. And the answer is I can draw this in the bicategory of Tambara modules. Why bi? So far I called it a category because I told you that there are Tambara modules from C to D and they form a category. What I didn't tell you is that if I have a Tambara module now from D to another category E over the same, so these are all Tambara modules for the same monoidal category, then I can compose them and get a Tambara module from C to E. Okay. So there is a bicategory called TAMB, where objects are M categories and morphisms are Tambara modules, and morphisms of Tambara modules are the two morphisms, okay? And there is a string diagram calculus for Tambara modules, as there is a string diagram calculus for every bicategory. If you remember, like formal string diagrams also have a notion of coloring of the regions. So monoidal string diagram for monoidal categories are just a special case in which regions are all colored of the same color, namely transparent or white. But here I can actually take advantage of this and get out a very neat theory and calculus to actually draw optics in the most general way, okay? So I'm not constrained to have the residual being in the same category as the forward part or the backward part. They can all be in different categories, but they get represented as Tambara modules between different categories, and this gives us a way to draw them all together. And the interesting thing is that, especially when C is different than D, M has this role of communicating between the forward and the backward part, okay? And this can be seen by the fact that when I draw diagrams in this category, all objects have a direction. So objects in C have a direction to the left, objects in D have direction to the right, but objects in M can be represented both as objects going to the left and objects going to the right. There's no difference. And the reason is there is something which bends the wire, okay? So makes M some kind of dual category, which is able to communicate between both phases of the process, okay? And this turns out to be an actual, I call it epsilon because it's an actual counit of an actual adjunction, is an adjunction in the category of Tambara modules, bicategory Tambara modules. And this is basically what makes the whole thing of optics relevant for cybernetics, okay? So what happens now is that I can represent optics on something like this. Okay, this is the forward part, this is the backward part. And as you can see, like, as I said before, this part wouldn't be able to communicate with this part if there wasn't, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. My headphones beeped and I don't know what this means. So I was saying they wouldn't be able to communicate if it was not for M, which can bend and actually make a bridge between the two. And this is interpreted in cybernetics as saying that M, which I told you is 3D actions is getting represented inside on D and C, some kind of process theory for agents participating in the interaction. And so what they do is they do an action here, they remember something, and when feedback comes, they use their memory to propagate this feedback. Okay, so this core unit is very, very important, and in a sense ties together all the structure around and provides an interesting conceptual picture for cybernetic systems. That's all for me. I just wanted to tell you some open questions, but I guess this is it.